I never thought a wedding could turn into the moment my family stopped seeing me as human. At my son Daniel Collins' wedding, I stood in a room full of smiling faces, crystal glasses, and soft music, yet in a single instant everything I had ever done for my family felt erased. Jessica Miller, my daughter-in-law, turned toward me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and before I could even understand what was happening, she pushed my face down into a serving dish of warm mashed potatoes right in front of everyone. It wasn't the heat that shocked me, it was the silence that followed. No gasps, no movement, no one stepping forward. Just a frozen room pretending not to see. I remember lifting my head slowly, feeling the weight of every stare that suddenly found the floor, the walls, anywhere but me. I didn't scream. I didn't stand up in anger. I simply reached for the linen napkin beside my plate and began wiping my face as though I had spilled something on myself, because that was the only way I knew how to survive moments like this, by pretending I still had dignity left to protect. Daniel sat 2 tables away, holding a glass of champagne he never lifted to his lips, his eyes locked somewhere between me and the tablecloth, as if looking directly at me would force him to choose a side he wasn't ready to choose. Around us, the wedding continued, soft music playing over laughter that felt too distant to be real. A toast was being prepared, forks tapped gently against glasses, and I realized something unsettling. The world does not stop when you are humiliated, it just learns how to look past you. I stayed seated because standing felt like admitting defeat, and leaving felt like disappearing entirely. Instead, I straightened my posture, smoothed my dress, and told myself that I had endured worse things in silence before. But even as I held my composure, my mind began to drift backward, searching for the moment everything started to shift. It wasn't sudden, not really. There were smaller moments before this one, quieter cuts that I had chosen to ignore. The way Jessica stopped asking my opinion during family conversations. The way my seat at holidays slowly moved, further from the center of the table. The way Daniel would gently interrupt me, smiling as he said, "Mom, let's not make this complicated." I had told myself it was adjustment, that every new marriage needed space, that I should be grateful just to be included. But sitting there with cold mashed potatoes clinging to my skin, I began to wonder if inclusion had ever been the real intention. The room around me blurred slightly as I remembered the first time Jessica looked at me not as Daniel's mother, but as a problem to manage. It had been a simple dinner, nothing dramatic, just a suggestion I had made about seating arrangements. She had smiled then too, that same controlled expression, and said softly that things would be easier if I trusted her judgment more. I had nodded because I wanted peace more than I wanted to be right. Now I understood that peace had a cost I was still paying. I glanced again at Daniel, hoping for something, anything, a sign that he saw me, that he understood what had just happened, but his expression remained carefully neutral, like a man practicing distance. And in that moment, I realized I was no longer part of the story they were all celebrating around me. I was only a background detail they could ignore when necessary, and that realization settled over me heavier than anything else that night. I stayed seated long after the moment passed, not because I was comfortable, but because I could not find a way to leave without turning the entire room into something even more uncomfortable than it already was. The wedding reception continued as if nothing had happened, the music flowing softly again, glasses clinking, conversations restarting in careful, measured tones that avoided my table entirely. I could feel the warmth of the room around me, yet it no longer reached me. It was as if I had been placed behind invisible glass, still present, but no longer part of the atmosphere. Jessica Miller was now laughing with a group of guests near the dance floor, her posture relaxed, her expression bright, as though the last few minutes had never existed. That calmness unsettled me more than the act itself. Daniel Collins finally stood from his seat and walked toward the bar without looking in my direction, his movements slow, deliberate, almost rehearsed, as if distance was something he had practiced before this day. I lowered my gaze to my hands resting in my lap, noticing how carefully I was still holding myself together, how deeply I was relying on habits I had built over a lifetime of avoiding conflict. A server passed by and asked if I needed anything, his voice polite but detached, and I simply shook my head because I did not trust my voice to sound steady. The truth was I was not thinking about food or drink anymore. I was thinking about patterns, about how moments like this do not appear from nowhere. They build quietly over time until they feel sudden only to the person who was not paying attention. My mind began to drift back to the months leading up to the wedding, small fragments I had dismissed at the time. I remembered one afternoon when I arrived early to help with seating plans and Jessica had already rearranged everything, smiling as she told me it was more efficient her way. I remembered how Daniel had placed a hand on my shoulder and said I should not worry about details because Jessica had everything under control. At the time, I told myself it was progress, that a younger couple needed space to establish their own traditions. But now those memories felt different, like pieces of a picture I had refused to complete. I looked around the room and noticed how naturally I had been placed at the edge of every conversation, not through explicit exclusion, but through a series of gentle repositionings that no one ever had to justify. Even the seating arrangement at this wedding had placed me slightly apart from the main family table, something I had noticed but chosen not to question. I told myself it was logistical, practical, unimportant. But sitting there now, I realized how many times I had made excuses for being positioned further and further from the center of my own family. My chest felt tight, not from what had happened earlier, but from the growing awareness that I had been adapting to being diminished long before today. I glanced once more toward Daniel, hoping for some small acknowledgement, a glance, a hesitation, anything that suggested shared reality. But he was focused entirely on a conversation near the bar, his laughter polite but distant. Jessica passed behind him and briefly touched his arm, and he turned toward her immediately, as if responding to a signal I could no longer hear. I understood then that I was not part of the alignment that held this family together anymore. I was an observation point, something they moved around rather than included. And in that quiet realization, I felt something shift inside me, not anger yet, not even sadness, but a clearer awareness of how far I had already been placed outside the life I thought I was still part of. It was only after I stopped trying to rejoin the room that I began to notice what had always been there, just never fully acknowledged. From where I sat, slightly removed from the center of the reception hall, I could see the rhythm of the evening more clearly, the way groups formed and reformed around Jessica Miller as though she were the center of gravity. She moved through conversations with ease, her laughter arriving exactly when it was expected, her hand occasionally resting on Daniel Collins in a way that looked natural to everyone else. Daniel, for his part, followed her lead without hesitation, responding to her cues more quickly than he ever responded to mine. I had spent so many years believing family dynamics were simply about adaptation, about learning new roles as children grow and marriages form. But watching them now, I realized I had been quietly edited out of scenes I thought I was still part of. A waiter passed and placed a tray of champagne near my table, but I did not reach for it. Instead, I watched as Jessica leaned in close to Daniel and whispered something that made him nod immediately, as if agreement was not a decision but a habit. I found myself thinking back to earlier moments I had once dismissed as ordinary. There had been a Sunday dinner a few months before the wedding when I had arrived at their home with a small dessert I had baked, only to find Jessica had already prepared an elaborate meal and suggested I leave my dish in the kitchen so everything would look more coordinated. I remembered how she said it with a smile that sounded almost thoughtful, and how Daniel had later told me it was better to let Jessica handle hosting because she was good at it. At the time, I had accepted it as practicality, but now it replayed in my mind with a different tone, one that felt less like coordination and more like direction. Another memory surfaced without warning, a family discussion about seating at the rehearsal dinner where my suggestions were met with polite silence until Jessica rephrased them in her own words, and suddenly everyone agreed. I had laughed then, telling myself it did not matter who said it as long as it was accepted, but I was beginning to understand that acceptance had never been the point. It was control, subtle and consistent, always delivered with calm assurance that made resistance feel unnecessary. I looked down at my hands again, noticing how still I was keeping them, how carefully I had trained myself over the years to remain composed in rooms where I felt increasingly invisible. Across the hall, Jessica laughed again, a sound that carried just far enough for me to hear, but not enough for me to join. Daniel stood beside her, Listini. I do not know exactly when I stopped feeling like a guest at the wedding and started feeling like a memory no one wanted to acknowledge, but by the time the evening had progressed into its later hours, The shift had become undeniable. The celebration continued in full motion around me, yet I was no longer being moved by it. Instead, I watched it the way one might watch a familiar story from a distance, noticing details that only become visible once emotional participation has faded. Jessica Miller remained at the center of nearly every interaction, her presence guiding the flow of attention without effort. Daniel Collins stood beside her most of the time, occasionally stepping away only to return as if drawn back by habit rather than choice. I observed how easily conversations adjusted when she entered them, how quickly people recalibrated their tone and posture, and I began to understand that influence in a room like this is rarely loud. It is consistent, quiet, and rarely questioned. I found myself thinking again about the small adjustments I had experienced over the past year, each one insignificant on its own, but together forming a pattern I had not wanted to recognize. There had been the invitation lists that changed without discussion, the family decisions that were finalized before I was informed, and the gentle but persistent reminders that certain matters were already handled. At the time, I had interpreted these moments as efficiency, even maturity within a growing family structure. Now they felt like steps in a process I had unknowingly agreed to participate in without ever being asked for consent. I looked across the room and saw Daniel laughing briefly at something Jessica said, and I tried to remember the last time I had made him laugh like that. The memory did not come easily. Instead, what surfaced were quieter moments, interruptions in conversation, postponed phone calls, and short responses that ended discussions before they could fully begin. I had told myself each time that he was busy, that adulthood reshapes communication, that distance is natural. But sitting there in the softened light of the reception hall, I began to see how consistently I had been adjusting my expectations downward in order to preserve the feeling of inclusion. A soft announcement signaled the beginning of a planned photograph session, and guests began to shift toward the designated area near the floral arch. I remained seated for a moment longer, watching as groups naturally formed without hesitation, without needing instruction, as if everyone instinctively knew where they belonged. No one looked in my direction to signal movement, and I realized I had become someone who was no longer part of the natural flow of decision or direction. When I finally stood, it was not because I had been invited, but because staying seated any longer felt like continuing a role I no longer recognized. As I moved slowly toward the edge of the gathering, I became aware of how carefully I was now observing everything, as though distance had sharpened perception rather than dulled it. Jessica was speaking with the photographer, arranging positions with calm authority, while Daniel stood slightly behind her, nodding occasionally, his attention following hers without deviation. I noticed how rarely anyone paused to question her suggestions, how quickly her preferences became group decisions without visible effort. It was not dominance in the loud sense I had once imagined control to be. It was something far more subtle, something that worked through agreement rather than force. I paused near the edge of the group, uncertain where I was meant to stand, and for a brief moment no one noticed I had stopped moving. That absence of acknowledgement did not feel dramatic. It felt factual, and in that fact, something inside me settled into a clearer shape, one that did not require explanation to exist. I remained near the edge of the gathering longer than I intended, not because I was waiting for anything in particular, but because I was beginning to understand that no one was expecting me to move with them. The photographer was now directing guests into tighter groups, adjusting positions with quick gestures, and each adjustment seemed to confirm the same invisible structure I had been noticing all evening. Jessica Miller stood slightly forward of everyone else, her hand occasionally lifting to guide Daniel Collins into place beside her, and he followed without hesitation, as if the simplest form of harmony was to remain aligned with her direction. I watched this without interruption, not with resentment at first, but with a growing sense of clarity that made the room feel different than it had earlier. It was no longer just a celebration. It was an organized narrative, and I was not assigned a clear role within it. When the photographer gestured for family members to gather closer, I noticed how naturally people adjusted their positions, stepping in without confusion or discussion. I, on the other hand, remained slightly apart until someone finally noticed the gap and gave me a small polite gesture to step forward, as if correcting a placement error rather than including a missing person. I complied without protest, moving into the group, But even within the circle, I felt the subtle difference in how space formed around me. Jessica stood closest to Daniel, their shoulders nearly aligned, while I ended up slightly offset, a detail so small that no one would comment on it, yet significant enough that I could feel it in the way the moment was framed. The camera flashed repeatedly, capturing versions of the same arrangement, and I realized that photographs do not simply record events, they define them. They decide who appears centered and who appears secondary. After the photographer finished the main sequence, guests began to relax again, drifting back toward their tables or toward small conversations near the bar. I did not immediately follow any direction, instead pausing to observe how effortlessly transitions occurred for everyone else. Jessica was already speaking with a group of relatives, her expression animated, her posture open, while Daniel stood nearby, listening more than contributing, his attention still subtly anchored to her presence. I tried to recall how often I had once believed that family unity meant shared attention, shared acknowledgement, shared awareness of one another's presence. But what I was seeing now was something different. It was alignment without explanation, cohesion without invitation. As I moved slowly back toward my seat, I passed a table where a few guests were discussing travel plans for the FO. I did not move from my seat immediately after that realization settled in, because something about it made even the simplest actions feel heavier than before, as if every gesture required a level of intention I had never needed to consider. The reception continued its steady rhythm around me, with guests drifting between tables and conversation clusters forming and dissolving with ease. Yet I found myself observing it all with a kind of detached attention, no longer searching for where I belonged within it. Daniel Collins was still near Jessica Miller, their presence together so natural that it no longer looked like coordination but assumption, as if one presence automatically implied the other. I watched him carefully now, not with expectation, but with the quiet curiosity of someone studying a pattern that had already completed itself. He nodded when she spoke, adjusted his position when she moved, and occasionally smiled at the right moments. But there was something in his attentiveness that felt less like choice and more like alignment, as though disagreement had become unnecessary in his world long before this evening. I remembered how different he used to be when he was younger, when he would still look to me first in moments of uncertainty, when my presence still registered as a point of reference rather than background. That memory did not arrive with bitterness, only distance, as if I were recalling a version of life that belonged to someone I once knew but could no longer access in the same way. A group of guests passed behind me, laughing softly about travel plans and work schedules, and I realized how easily life continues when someone is no longer part of its immediate focus. No one needed to be unkind for that to happen. It simply required consistent attention directed elsewhere. I noticed Daniel glance briefly in my direction once during a pause in conversation, but the moment was so brief, so uncommitted, that I could not even be sure it was meant for me. If it was, it carried no intention to interrupt what he was already part of. Jessica, meanwhile, was speaking to a relative with animated ease, her tone warm and controlled, her gestures measured in a way that made every interaction feel intentional. She did not appear unaware of me. Rather, she appeared fully aware of how the room distributed its focus, and how easily that focus could remain stable without needing to shift. I found myself thinking again about the earlier moments of the evening, not the obvious ones, but the quieter transitions I had once overlooked. The way I was not asked certain questions, the way decisions were finalized before reaching me, the way my responses were sometimes acknowledged but not carried forward into action. At the time I had told myself it was simply efficiency within a busy family event, but now those moments aligned into something more structured, something that had developed gradually enough to avoid resistance. I looked down at the edge of the table in front of me, noticing the polished surface reflecting fragments of movement from the room, and I thought about how reflection can distort scale, making everything appear closer or more distant depending on where you stand. I was still physically present within the wedding, still seated among family, still technically included in the arrangement of the evening, but inclusion, I realized, was not only about presence. It was about positioning within attention. Daniel laughed at something Jessica said, a short, effortless sound, and she responded with a slight touch to his arm that seemed to confirm something between them without needing words. I did not feel excluded in a sudden or dramatic way. It was slower than that. More like noticing a room gradually dimming until you realize the light has been reduced not all at once, but in stages so small you adapt before you are aware of the change. And in that quiet recognition, I understood that the evening was no longer revealing anything new. It was simply confirming what had already been established long before I chose to see it. I began to understand that what I was experiencing was not a single moment of exclusion, but a sustained structure of distance that had been built so gradually I had once mistaken it for normal change. The wedding reception continued around me with the same polished rhythm, yet my awareness of it had shifted so completely that I no longer saw it as participation. I saw it as observation. Daniel Collins remained close to Jessica Miller, and their interaction had settled into a kind of effortless synchronization that required no explanation. When she moved slightly, he adjusted without hesitation. When she paused, he waited without question. It was not something dramatic or overt, but rather a continuous alignment that spoke more clearly than words ever could. I noticed now how rarely he broke that rhythm, even when speaking to others. His attention always returned to her, as if she were the point from which all other conversations were measured. I sat back in my chair and allowed myself to watch without trying to interpret in emotional terms, focusing instead on what was actually happening in front of me. Patterns that had once felt accidental were now repeating with such consistency that they could no longer be dismissed. A server approached our table briefly, offering to refill glasses, and when I declined, they moved on without pause, immediately shifting attention elsewhere. That small moment lingered longer than it should have, not because of what was said, but because of how naturally I was not expected to remain engaged in the flow of service or conversation. Across the room, Jessica laughed again, a controlled and confident sound that seemed to signal approval from those closest to her. Daniel responded immediately, his expression softening in a way that felt automatic, and I found myself noticing how quickly emotional cues were exchanged between them, as if they were operating within a shared system that did not require explanation. I thought back to earlier years, trying to locate the point where my role had begun to change, not in a single event, but in gradual transitions that I had consistently rationalized. Family decisions that were once discussed openly had become finalized conversations I was informed of after the fact. Suggestions I made were received politely, then later reintroduced by someone else in slightly different words and accepted immediately. Each instance had seemed minor at the time, easily explained, not worth confronting. But now, viewed together, they formed a continuity that no longer felt incidental. I looked down at my hands again, noticing how still they remained, as if even my body had learned not to interrupt the space around me. The reception hall lights reflected softly off the table surfaces, creating a warm atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the internal clarity I was beginning to experience. Nothing about the environment had changed, yet my relationship to it had shifted so completely that I could no longer participate in it in the same way. Daniel glanced briefly in my direction again during a pause in conversation, but his attention did not remain. It passed over me without anchoring, like something acknowledged but not retained. Jessica leaned slightly toward him and spoke quietly, and he responded. Immediately, his focus returning to her without interruption. I realized then that what I had been calling distance was not absence, but reallocation of attention that had never been reversed. I was still physically present within the structure of the evening, still seated at the table designated for family, still included in the formal arrangement of the wedding, but inclusion itself had proven to be something more complex than placement. It required consistent recognition, repeated engagement, and mutual visibility. And as I sat there watching the final movements of the reception unfold around me, I understood that what had changed was not the room, nor the people within it, but my position within their awareness, which had settled into a stable configuration long before I had noticed it was shifting. I stayed seated even as the reception began to slowly transition into its final rhythm, not because I was waiting for anything anymore, but because I had reached a point where movement no longer felt connected to emotion or expectation. Around me, the wedding continued its soft unraveling, guests shifting between final conversations, standing to say polite goodbyes, gathering belongings with the careful coordination that comes at the end of something formal. Daniel Collins and Jessica Miller remained close near the center of the remaining group, their presence still drawing attention without effort, still shaping the direction of nearby interactions. I watched them now without searching for meaning, as if the need to interpret had finally settled into something quieter and more stable inside me. Jessica spoke to a relative with calm assurance, her expression unchanged from earlier, while Daniel listened with the same steady focus he had maintained throughout the evening whenever she was involved. There was no tension in their interaction, no visible conflict, only continuity, and that continuity itself began to feel like the clearest explanation of everything I had experienced. I noticed how few people questioned her presence at the center of conversations, how naturally she became the point around which decisions, responses, and attention gathered. It was not forceful, not abrupt, but sustained, and because of that it went largely unnoticed by everyone except someone who had begun to observe rather than participate. A few guests approached my table briefly to say polite farewells, their words warm but brief, their attention already shifting elsewhere before the exchange had fully ended. I responded with equal politeness, though I could feel the distance between social courtesy and actual inclusion more clearly than I had at any earlier point in the evening. When I looked back toward Daniel, I saw him briefly checking his phone before turning his attention back to Jessica, who was now organizing something with the photographer near the exit area of the hall. It struck me how easily attention moved away from me without disruption, how naturally the flow of the evening continued without requiring my presence to anchor it. I thought again about the earlier parts of the night, not with emotion, but with a kind of structured reflection, revisiting each moment not as isolated incidents, but as a sequence that had gradually revealed its own logic. The seating arrangements that placed me slightly apart, the conversations that continued without my input being carried forward, the decisions that had been made before I was informed, each one now felt less like coincidence and more like consistent placement within a system I had not been fully aware of. I stood once more, slowly, not because I had been prompted, but because remaining still had begun to feel like remaining within a definition that no longer applied to me. As I moved toward the edge of the reception space, I noticed how naturally groups reformed without adjusting for my position, how the room continued to organize itself without interruption or acknowledgement of my movement. There was no dramatic moment of realization, no confrontation, no final exchange of words. Instead, there was simply clarity, quiet and persistent, forming from repetition rather than shock. Daniel and Jessica were now preparing for the final photographs near the entrance, their movements aligned, their attention shared without hesitation. I stopped briefly at the edge of the hall, not waiting for recognition, but observing the final arrangement of the evening as it settled into completion. And in that stillness, I understood that what I had been witnessing all night was not exclusion in a single act, but a structure that had been in place long before I ever began to notice it, one that no longer required explanation to maintain itself. I did not realize I had already started leaving until I was halfway toward the exit of the reception hall, moving slowly through the final flow of guests without anyone needing to guide me or stop me. The evening had reached its natural conclusion, with clusters of people saying their final goodbyes, exchanging brief embraces, and stepping into the cooler air outside the venue. The sound of the wedding behind me had softened into a distant blend of music and conversation that no longer required my participation to understand. Daniel Collins and Jessica Miller were near the entrance, still surrounded by a small group of relatives, their attention focused on final photographs and polite farewells. I saw Daniel glance in my direction once, briefly, not with urgency or concern, but with the same neutral awareness he had shown throughout the evening whenever our paths crossed. Jessica did not look toward me at all, her focus remaining entirely on the moment she was shaping around her. I paused just outside the threshold of the hall, feeling the shift in temperature as the night air met the warmth of the celebration behind me. For a moment, I did not think about what had happened earlier in terms of right or wrong, dignity or humiliation, inclusion or exclusion. Those words felt too small for what I now understood. What I had experienced was not a single act, not even a series of incidents that could be isolated and explained away. It was a consistent pattern of placement, attention, and absence that had been unfolding long before this evening and would likely continue in the same form without needing to be named. I adjusted my coat slowly, not as a reaction, but as a final act of physical grounding, and I realized how calm I had become in comparison to the earlier hours of the night. There was no longer confusion about where I stood within their world, because that question itself no longer required an answer. I had spent so much of my life interpreting silence as temporary, distance as accidental, and absence of acknowledgement as something that could be corrected with time or patience. But standing there now, I understood that repetition reveals intention more clearly than words ever could. I thought about Daniel as a child, about the way he once reached for my hand without thinking, and I recognized that the person he had become did not erase that past, but no longer depended on it either. People do not always leave you in a dramatic way. Sometimes they simply stop orienting their decisions around your presence, until you realize you are no longer part of the system that once included you. I looked back through the glass doors of the hall one final time, seeing the movement of the reception winding down, the final photographs being taken, the last conversations fading into closure. There was no hostility in what I saw, no confrontation left unresolved, only continuation without me as a required point of reference. And in that absence of disruption, I found something unexpectedly steady. I had not lost my place in a sudden moment. I had simply reached the point where I could finally see where my place had shifted to long before I ever questioned it. As I turned away and stepped further into the night, I carried that clarity with me, not as pain, not as anger, but as recognition that no longer needed anyone else to confirm it.